Finland's maternity services appear to be in crisis. Across the country, people giving birth routinely struggle to get access to hospital maternity care. Yet Finland is a wealthy country, famous for its pronatalism and welfare state, including universal access to healthcare and top-notch, highly subsidized childcare services. In fact, Finland's maternity services are famous in their own right, with their free maternity package scheme known as the baby box, which has been going in Finland since the 1930s. The fact that there would be a problem with maternity services in such a context seems strange. So what's going on? But first, let me tell you about something apparently very different: the Kalevala. The Kalevala is the Finnish national epic. It was compiled by Elias Lönnrot in the 19th century, based on old Finnish ballads, lyrical songs, and incantations that were part of the Finnish and Karelian oral tradition. It is a magical tale, and one with heroes, monsters, and villains. In 2019, I moved to Finland with my 1-year-old and my partner to carry out ethnographic fieldwork, a form of research where you live among people in order to learn about them. And I was working on a research project. Before starting the research in Finland, I didn't know much about the Kalevala. I'm not sure I had even heard of it. But once there, I started to notice signs of it everywhere. In reading it, one part of the story really caught my eye and stayed with me. It stays with me even now. It is the story of a pregnancy in the 45th rune or poem of the Kalevala. More specifically, it is the story of the pregnancy of a black woman, who is one of several black women who are villains in the story. She's described many times in the text as black and evil and old and ugly and blind, and also as a witch. In the story, she is impregnated by the east wind, and the Kalevala has more than one tale of impregnation by the wind. And she becomes pregnant with 9 babies. The story describes her going into labor, wandering alone in labor for days with nowhere to go. She eventually wanders northward into the evil lands of the north, which represent the underworld. Upon reading it, even though she is cast as a villain, I could not help but imagine myself in her position. I too was a black woman, and when I read it I was nearly 40, having just had a baby. That's considered elderly prima gravida by maternity services. As I make this film, I'm pregnant again, even older, perhaps uglier. I imagine myself laboring on the move, wandering without care or comfort among the rocks and trees, wondering if I or the baby will survive. It's terrifying to imagine. In the story, another woman, the mistress of the evil northern lands, the main antagonist of this whole tale, takes the laboring woman into her home and helps her deliver her babies after she has wandered for so long. I don't think the rune singers or the writer of this text version of the Kalevala meant for the audience to associate themselves with this old, ugly, disabled black woman. After all, they do say she is evil. I don't think you are supposed to care about her children. After all, they represent a threat to the good guys in this story, the ones who are supposed to represent the Finns. The 9 children represent the 9 diseases, which are unleashed on the good guys. And the hero defeats these evil children just after this part of the story. As I learned more about Finland, the story stayed in my head and made me think strange things. Could such an old myth tell us something about the world we live in today? Could something from a story like this, which we are not meant to believe literally, still be live and acting on the world? Something like a ghost. The Kalevala was written by a man called Elias Lönnrot, a medical doctor and folklorist in the 19th century. The writing of it became very important to the idea of Finland as it was being created, because prior to 1917, the Finns were a group of people living in a territory that was controlled by other empires for hundreds of years, for many years by the Swedish Empire and then by the Russian Empire. Lönnrot's major work, the Kalevala, is a tale woven together from what had been an oral tradition. They were sung poems, and Lönnrot travelled all over so-called Greater Finland to collect them, including to places which so far have never become part of the state of Finland, but which once were imagined to be parts of a future Finnish nation. The writing and publishing of the Kalevala was important to the creation of this Finnish nation, and as such, all children in Finland still read it in schools. The story of the woman suffering without care as she is in labor came back to me as I learned more about the situation of Finnish maternity care during my research. I learned that maternity care cuts in the northern regions meant that women had no local hospitals in which they could give birth, and had to cross hundreds of kilometers to get to the nearest ones, sometimes giving birth on the road. But whilst the problem might have been most acute in these northern areas, the problem eventually also came to the region that includes Helsinki, Uusimaa, where most of the population of Finland lives. Now, some people have an answer for why this is happening, which is quite simple. Scarcity. Not enough resource. And scarcity, they would suggest, is a result of who else but newcomers. But they don't really mean people who just arrived this week. This is an idea of time, which is politically important, but not so much based on facts. Who is causing the breakdown in society? Well, who is usually blamed? Racialized immigrant groups and queer people. The logic is, we simply can't stretch enough for these people whom we never expected to be here, who are new. Of course, queer people are not new, and Finland has never been the bastion of white homogeneity that some claim. And scarcity, of course, is a political choice dressed up as a natural phenomenon. But the problem in Finland is not just who is offered care or denied it, but in the care that is given when one can find their way to a hospital to give birth. Whilst I was living in Finland, a Me Too scandal broke. It was dubbed Me Too Birth Giver in English. And it exposed the largely hidden and private horrors of obstetric violence in Finland through hundreds of accounts of terrible birth experiences shared in order to try to create change. As this was emerging, I encountered people, feminists, responding to this in surprising ways, by simply rejecting the accounts and saying that it was offensive and ridiculous to say such things about the maternity services. Even the headlines were surprising. They so often rejected these perspectives and experiences and blamed the people, largely women, themselves, taking no responsibility for the problem. Why would this be? One of my collaborators, philosopher Dr. Tiia Sudenkaarne, and I have been thinking a lot about ethics, reproduction, and healthcare in Finland as part of this research, and some of our thinking may be applied here. Finland's history is much darker than one might imagine in a lot of different ways. In terms of healthcare, Finland had a period of explicit state eugenics, in which eugenic abortions and sterilizations were forced on people, because the reproduction of some people was considered a threat to the nation. Whilst these practices were officially ended in 1970, until earlier this year, 2023, the legacy of this lingered on in the legal requirement of medical sterilization for trans people who wanted to change their gender marker. Tiia and I have argued that this has resulted in faulty moral settings within the welfare state, which have profoundly affected ethical judgment within healthcare, leaving the country with what we have called a haunted ethics, haunted by reproductive injustice. This effect may be producing a system of care that is experienced as cruelty and neglect. from contemporary eco-fascists, inside and outside academia, we learn that reproduction is very much still figured by some as a threat, which requires intervention. One popular Finnish eco-fascist, Pentti Linkola, wrote a lot about reproduction. In 2018, he was voted as the person who had done the most to preserve Finland's natural heritage. And after his recent death in 2020, condolences and praise for his efforts were sent by Finland's Minister for Foreign Affairs and by the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Linkola was explicitly pro-violence, and he advocated for eugenic abortion, sterilization, and infanticide, with birth, he thought, only allowable by permit. Under this logic, births are represented as a threat to the natural environment, a concept with enormous resonance in Finland, where the idea of Finns as a nature-loving people living in harmony with forests coexists with Finnish companies' rampant destruction of forests, both in Finland and elsewhere. But eco-fascists tend to draw our attention, instead, to the bodies of those black and brown people who can get pregnant, suggesting their, or perhaps I should say our, reproduction as the true threat. We are a natural disaster. Our entry to Finland, our childbearing. And so, for me at least, this brings me back to wandering in the forest, looking for help to bear my evil children, as those who hear my story do not feel compassion for me. The thing about eco-fascism is that you don't have to have any special radicalization to it when you start from certain baselines. So it's not like red pilling or Islamic radicalization. It often makes sense to people who have been propagandized with racist population rhetoric, the myth of overpopulation that has been spread since the 1970s, alongside racist demonization of non-white immigration. Perhaps even if we build a channel to send our cruelty away from ourselves and toward those who we demonize and choose not to care for, that cruelty may jump its banks and come for us in time, because Finnish people who wouldn't have been targeted by state eugenic policies or xenophobic hate seem to now face cruelty and neglect from their medical system, as well as a lack of compassion from fellow Finns about their wandering and suffering.